Welcome to the Nemeth Report podcast. I'm Dr. Tammy Nemeth, energy historian, analyst, and consultant, and I'll be your host. Today I'm joined by Dr. Gene Nelson, co-founder and senior legal researcher for Californians for Green Nuclear Power. You can see he's wearing green. He spent more than a decade fighting to keep Diablo Canyon, California's last nuclear power plant, operating. Now, our conversation is going to explore three core subjects: what Dr. Nelson's long campaign reveals about how energy decisions are actually made in California, the real costs of retiring firm zero carbon generation, and lastly, why several analysts see China's approach to energy security as a strategic warning for America. Now, why talk about China in a conversation with a nuclear advocate focused on Diablo Canyon? Well, maybe Beijing's hidden hand has helped shape the very policies that threaten firm, reliable power in California, other blue states, and sometimes at the federal level. Now, the fight over Diablo Canyon is more than just a California story. It's a test of whether America still understands what energy security actually requires. Dr. Gene Nelson, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me on this morning, Tammy. It's definitely quite an honor to be here to talk about these subjects. And I'm hoping that really the bulk of our time will be spent on the role of China, because it really is amazing as I start to peel away what's going on, how China has played in, what a big part they play, and that it is about pursuit of geopolitical advantage. So
that's a great point. But before we get there, I'm wondering if you could just take a moment to introduce yourself, your background, and how you came to be an advocate for green nuclear power.
All right, great. So I'm 74 years old. I grew up in Southern California, earned my bachelor's at Harvey Mudd College in biophysics in 1973. And they told us at the time, all of you folks, number one, you should go on and earn a doctorate, and number two, you'll become leaders. Well, that's an interesting. It didn't work out that way. Let me just put it that way. But I did follow their advice to go to graduate school, because the claim was, well, you won't be taken seriously unless you have a doctorate. The actual role was to recruit fresh, inexpensive young blood to staff positions at universities. Pretty disgusting. So my opportunity cost for earning a PhD, which I completed in 1984, 11 years full-time work, was easily a couple of $1 million in terms of foregone income that I could have. There were lots of people that graduated from Mudd, went on and had really good jobs that were doing really interesting science. Well, I was one of the fools that went on to earn a PhD, because what I actually found out was, after my first research-centric job, which among other things took me to Japan, was that I was no longer fresh young blood. In fact, I was getting dangerously close to the so-called protected class under the Age Discrimination Act of 1967, that you had a theoretical protection for hiring, promotion, retention, or termination decisions. Nope, we're not interested in you. And so there was an article in the Wall Street Journal in 1993 that's essentially impossible to get now. You have to, I keep a copy that I send out to people that are interested in it. It's titled "Black Hole Opens in Scientist Job Roles." It was published on April 14th of 1993 on page B1 of the Wall Street Journal.
Wow.
And it was written by G. Pascal Zachary, who was a globalist. But he painted a surprisingly sympathetic picture of me, because I was the core of this article. I was at that time teaching a more than full-time load at a community college, and my take-home pay, my salary was about $300 a week. So basically,
Wow.
I was getting around minimum wage to be a PhD college professor in science. That is regrettably a very typical story for PhDs. Basically, because in the United States, the colleges and universities used a corrupt U.S. representative named Joshua Albert to obtain a really unusual privilege, which was the privilege to hire unlimited numbers of imported scientists and researchers. That that privilege persists to today. There absolutely was never any reason for it other than colleges and universities wanted to control their costs. And the way that they could do that was they could bring in these imported people and they would work for peanuts
Yeah.
because what was being dangled for them was the promise of eventual third world citizen or eventual citizenship instead of living in their third world hellhole. I'm going to be really blunt here. The biggest beneficiaries of this controversial program have been China and India. So there's our China connection. But that really, that the whole situation there really got me very, very angry. But one of the things that I've learned is that I have to keep my anger inside and simply tell very objectively an outrageous story and then let people decide on their own after they think about what I have to say. Hey, there's something really going wrong here. And so I had to take a retraining program in order to even get a job. It was a so-called JTPA Title III program. And the core message in that program was you have got to reduce your expectations if you want to work. I lived in Dallas, Texas at the time. The superconducting super collider had just been canceled. And it was really a challenging time. So one of the things that I saw was I had to go to Atlanta to get some training. And this was a company called Nortel. You might be familiar with
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
And so Nortel had a big center in Atlanta. So I'm waiting at the Hartsfield Airport for my flight. And the museum in Atlanta, there was a science museum, had put up an exhibit for people to look at, passengers while they're waiting. And it was talking about how important science and engineering was to the Allies winning World War II.
Yeah.
And talked about all kinds of things like radar and penicillin and stuff like that. And it was all based on the fact that the U.S. had a really strong science and engineering enterprise that made a positive difference. Obviously, the really big story was the atomic bomb. And that exhibit that I saw in it was actually 1999, really, it still sticks with me today because this is really an amazing way that I see it that the political left has basically trashed the American science and engineering enterprise because it's been the experienced American citizen technical professionals have been largely replaced with fresh young blood, mostly young males from China and India. Both of those nations are socialist nations. India, for example, during the any of the Middle East conflicts, basically said, "Wash my hands." They didn't really, they didn't hinder, they didn't help. And
Yeah,
of
they
course,
maintain neutrality.
yeah, and that is, that's certainly that's not an ally. And of course, basically, they very aggressively lobby the government to continue this program, which was basically put in place totally fraudulently. And so for me, as a scientist, it's really important to be able to find a way to take at least a manageable piece of that conflict and analyze it and talk about it. And that's what we're going to do today.
Right. So basically, what you described is outsourcing America's science and engineering
Yes,
expertise,
absolutely.
just like they outsource manufacturing and industrial capacity.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And but energy is one thing you can't really outsource, except they are with respect to swapping reliable power for unreliable solar and wind and batteries, which are completely dependent on Chinese supply chains, which we'll
That's
get into in this
yes. Good,
conversation.
good, good. I'm
Uh,
glad we're going to
um,
get into that.
yeah, so, but I'm wondering, so um, before we talk a little bit more about China, I'm really interested to understand um, how you came involved in this enterprise to keep Diablo Canyon still operating. Because for my listeners who are primarily from Canada, they may not understand what happened there and why it's important. So if you could just give us a little bit of how you got involved with that and why it's important.
Okay, so my actual how I got involved in this actually it starts with my graduate work. One of my I had a three-member thesis committee, and one of my committee members was a guy named Dr. Fred Snell. He was definitely towards the left of in the political spectrum, but he had a really interesting experience because he was both an MD and a PhD. A brilliant man. He was head of the Biophysical Society, so he knew his way around. He knew politics, um, but what he did right after the end of World War II, he was in charge of a group of medical corpsmen that went to Hiroshima. And their job was to do a biological survey of the survivors.
Right.
Now, that survey, from what I can tell, was a truly gut wrenching experience. And
Yeah.
I'm informed by the fact that when I went to Japan on business in 1986, I very intentionally, because of my experiences with Dr. Snell, went to the museum for the bomb blast in Hiroshima. And I saw the gut wrenching exhibits where, you see charred remains of humans, things like that. And the management there does give you the option, if you need to, they have containers on the floor that you can vomit into.
Oh my gosh.
It's really horrible. And that actually, that's one of the threads of my activism is that I don't want another atomic war. And and it turns out that the best and most cost-effective way to get rid of special weapons material is put that material, downblend it, and use it as reactor fuel. Because once it's been in a reactor for more than 2 months, it becomes impractical for use for weapons. And it's really, really hard to get out the essentially a contaminant. It's an isotope called plutonium 240, and separating 239 from 240 plutonium is really, really hard. It requires the nation state's assets. It's not something you can do in a meth lab or something like that. No, it's really, really complicated. So um, that has really, so knowing that that's the way to do it, and it was actually validated. There was one of my inspirations, a guy named Dr. Thomas Neff, Neff, who was at MIT, and what he did was to after the Soviet Union imploded in 1990, he recognized that there were going to be a potential of loose nukes
Hmm.
in the former Soviet republics. And he said,
Yeah.
hey, we need to have some way to get them some hard currency so they can actually get themselves back on their feet again, because he knew that basically they were in really a world of hurt. And so he came up with the idea of doing this downblending. In this case, the equivalent of 20,000 Soviet atomic weapons. And that became the fuel for the U.S. reactor fleet. And if it had been used to power the fleet, it would have provided more than 2 years uh, of excuse me, more than 2 years of fuel for the entire fleet. It's a huge, huge program. It still has economic impacts today because the U.S. became dependent on Soviet reprocessing services or enrichment services,
Yeah.
um, which we're still working to essentially wean ourselves up. And they basically, because they have essentially free labor there, they really could undercut the U.S. And so I've talked with people from companies like Urenco in the U.S. that have actually that played a role in working to get those supply chains going in the U.S. again. But so I became aware of that, but the really the big piece was that anti uh, was being opposed to atomic warfare, and I was told as a graduate student, oh, you can make atomic bombs in a nuclear power reactor. Well, that was an interesting question, and I started to look into it. And I've learned enough about how to make an atomic bomb. I'm certainly not an expert, but I learned enough to recognize you don't use a nuclear power reactor for that. Um, so I was now armed with some new knowledge that basically I'd been told something wrong
Yeah.
about nuclear power. And my mom, she was aware of the difficulty I was having finding work in Dallas, and she had a older second husband, and he was starting to show signs of Alzheimer's. So she knew that she needed help, and I have an older brother and a younger sister, but because basically she saw what I had done with my life, that she felt that I would be the best person to help, and asked, basically made an offer that we couldn't refuse. Come out to California. I've got a place. I've purchased a place for you, and you'll help me. So, so that's okay. Here I am in San Luis Obispo, and so and again I have a PhD in radiation biophysics. So I start learning about Diablo Canyon Power Plant starting in 2006. And so, in fact, I worked as what's called an outage worker in April of 2007. So, but I was hired as a laborer. That means picking up trash, sweeping sidewalks, pouring concrete, things like that. That's what laborers do. Um, and I had to be rad worker qualified. Well, I was rad worker qualified. My boss recognized that I was really very good on safety, so he actually had me on my last day give a safety talk to the group. And at the end of that safety talk, I got a round of applause because people were engaged. I was able to figure out how to take some things that had happened recently. We had discovered a rattlesnake underneath the steps to the building that we hung out at, and I was part of the two people that relocated that snake rather than killing it. So anyway, that was my those 3 weeks were the only time I ever worked in the nuclear power industry. But I got to tour the plant and was really amazed when I saw this huge machine that makes roughly 10% of California's power, and it does it in a footprint of less than 1 square mile. To me, that was
Wow.
totally amazing. Um,
Yeah.
and so I started attending meetings of something called the Diablo Canyon Independent Safety Committee. And in those committee meetings, I heard all this stuff coming from very vocal opponents to nuclear power. And it wasn't based on fact. It was based on feelings. And so that really, I already had been a college professor at that time at two different colleges. Um, that really rubbed me the wrong way. So I started attending those meetings and started making public comments. So that's basically been going on for almost 2 decades. And I was definitely a voice in the wilderness there. Apparently, there had been some college professors back when Diablo Canyon started, but they retired, they aged out, And so basically, it was just the antis running the show.
Yeah.
Before this very important committee, basically, the Diablo Canyon Independent Safety Committee is a very unique committee where they have world-class scientists and engineers to serve as an independent backstop operated and funded by the state of California to make sure the plant runs safely. And they really have, very well-qualified people. One of the folks that has been a committee member, he started the same time that I started attending. He's still a committee member, and he's now also a senior official with a company called Kairos, Kairos. He was chair of the nuclear engineering department at University of California, Berkeley. So again, very, very well-qualified people. Dr. Bob Budnitz was a world expert in probabilistic risk assessment. So we had people that knew the science, but we had also PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric. Now, Pacific Gas and Electric is a really interesting animal. The name tells you that it's an interesting animal. Pacific Gas and Electric. So they operate several. At one time, they operated a lot more fossil-fired power plants, and they had decided, as part of essentially the push for nuclear power, they actually had the first really experimental reactor, Valicitos. Then they went on and made a small plant at Humboldt Bay, and then Diablo Canyon. So they had some background, but my take on Pacific Gas and Electric is there's two sides to the house. Two sides. One side pushes gas, which is dispatchable, and the other side pushes nuclear. And that is the apples to apples comparison that we need to look at, because it turns out that as I've dug into the engineering for solar, wind, and batteries, they produce what I call junk power. Their power that they produce doesn't have the muscle that you get from gas or coal or nuclear. It lacks an attribute called synchronous grid inertia, which is basically all these large rotating machines. They are rotating perfectly in synchrony, or almost perfectly in synchrony, across the grid, and they keep the grid going by the kinetic energy in those large rotating machines when there are inevitable changes, step changes in either load or in supply. You have to have a way to keep essentially, you need giant flywheel. And that is really a critical point that it took me a long time as a scientist to even understand, but it's something that turns out to be really super important, because what I also started to figure out, I started meeting with some other nuclear power advocates, is that we had to be prepared. We started in 2013. We had to be prepared for the possibility that the antis could try to shut the plant down. And this plant is one of the best run plants in the United States. It's incredibly reliable. It's incredibly clean. And so to have it shut down would be really, really tragic. And so we decided, prior to the surprise announcement on June 20th, 2016, that we would become an intervener before the California Public Utilities Commission. And the antis already were interveners, and they've been interveners for a really long time. And they basically, again, were running the show. Or they were permitted to run the show, because what was really going on behind the scenes, in large part, was about virtue signaling. Because California has basically, it's the home of NIMBY, not in my backyard. And So they've really worked to shut down fossil-fired plants, and they also, at the end of January 2012, they were responsible for, the state of California was responsible for needlessly shutting down San Onofre Nuclear Generation Station, a comparable sized plant to Diablo Canyon, essentially at the border of San Diego and Orange County, so about 100 miles or 200, correction, about 200 miles south of Diablo Canyon was San Onofre, but they were needlessly shut down instead of being repaired.
Yeah.
And we got involved as interveners. We tried to, among other things, show some of the conflicts of interest. But at the time that we got involved, we didn't have strong legal representation. And so basically we got rolled.
Yeah.
We were actually threatened with a big lawsuit if we kept up our difficult questions about why was this plant being closed. So we rolled. We were rolled. But shortly after that, we were able to reach out and contact Mike Gatto. And Mike Gatto was a 4-term California assemblyman, a Democrat, who recognized how important nuclear power was. And what he did was he started to teach me about how to do good pleadings, because he knew I had a good legal mind, because he'd seen some of what I'd already written. And how I got that experience was I went through a really nasty divorce involving 2 daughters who I'm still estranged from. But the only saving grace was that she served as the agent that introduced me to my 3rd wife, and we've been married for over 30 years. We've been through a lot together, and it's nice to celebrate. Like going last night to see the Australian Pink Floyd show. But that, so I knew my way around the courtroom already, and that turned out to be incredibly valuable, because Californians for Green Nuclear Power became the sole party of 55 in the Diablo Canyon cost proceeding that started in 2016, and we were tenacious in our support of keeping the plant running. And as we learned more, it's kind of like a game of whack-a-mole, because what the antis do is they come up with one story, and when we show that story is phony baloney, okay, we'll come up with a new one. We've got a whole bunch of that all really go around applying the precautionary principle to an extreme. Ooh, this might happen, and so we've had to really learn a lot, and also that then led to me learning a lot more about the entire energy landscape, because nuclear is just one piece of the puzzle. And in California, we discovered as we started to dig in that one of the companies that was pushing to shut down Diablo Canyon was Berkshire Hathaway Energy. And they operate a fleet of mostly coal-fired power plants in and around Wyoming. Well, why is that significant? Well, it turns out that Wyoming is the #1 coal state in the United States. It produces more coal than the next 6 states combined. The states we think of, like Kentucky and West Virginia and so forth. No, Wyoming is the leader. And also their coal happens to be a lot cleaner than the coal that you get back east. So here we have a company that operates this fleet, but it had been characterized by the Clean Air Task Force as operating one of the dirtiest fleets in North America. And they export their power to California. California has because of that NIMBYism, they have to import about 1/3 of their power. And
right. So I think it's more than just the NIMBYism. It's just that that whole policy framework has removed reliable energy from the
Absolutely.
grid and shutting
Absolutely.
down refineries, shutting down
Yeah.
everything. And so
Yes.
you have to ask yourself, the California government comes out with its clean power plan. Well, isn't nuclear the cleanest form of power out
Yes.
there,
That's
right?
and that was our core argument. And they kept coming. They kept picking up the talking points from the antis. It was like we had to. They clearly didn't want to accept what we had to say based on science and engineering and economics. And we have just had to be incredibly tenacious. And so, in fact, in 2022, the American Nuclear Society awarded me a presidential citation for my tenacious defense of keeping the plant running, which I've discovered it's not they don't just hand out presidential citations at the American Nuclear Society. You've got to do something that's really significant.
Yeah.
And the Diablo Canyon question really is, it really it is asking the question, well, are we going to pursue energy abundance and energy reliability in the United States, or are we going to follow Germany and deindustrialize and lose GDP and basically allow China to run the show? Because China is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. And we're going to talk about that some more, I know. But
Right.
that really, I mean, it was just so astounding to learn about this environmental hypocrisy. Here we have this state that says, "Oh, we're pointing the way forward," and the way forward is we're going to outsource our pollution to Wyoming.
Not think
And
about it at all, because it'll be coming over these clean wires.
yes, yes. Well, actually, in 2007, Berkshire Hathaway put out a PR piece about what they called their energy gateway, and I made sure to archive it. I'm really an information pack rat, but I always make sure that whenever I learned over time, I've got to show the provenance of where that information came from, and I'm really very meticulous about that. But what they said in this 2007 thing was, you can't tell what the source is at the destination of the energy gateway.
That's right.
And they're actually candid in saying that. Well, that document is no longer available except from places like CGNP, because they have aggressively lobbied the state of California. In 2022, they were the number 5 lobbyist. Number 5. And this is a company that does this niche business of selling power. And in 2023, they moved up to number 3. Well, we started looking into their filings on the urging of Attorney Gatto. And then we said, well, and Attorney Gatto told us that the California Fair Political Practices Commission, which is who runs this process, they're really good about this. Well, we discovered that, yeah, when we found a glaring lie in one of their lobbying disclosures, where they were required on a summary page to total up their lobbying expenditures. And in the first quarter of 2023, they had falsely reported a total of 0 when they were really spending over $2.7 million.
Wow, that's a
And this
big,
is
big
and
difference.
and this was on a page where, just like inches away from that is the statement that says, under penalty of perjury, I certify this to be a true and complete and accurate statement. And because Pacific Corp knew, Pacific Corp's the name of the company, Pacific Corp knew there was an automated process that would prepare a summary, which is what most of the journalists would look at.
Of course. Of course.
And so again, we filed a motion for them to correct it. They corrected it. And then we started looking, because we saw that math error mistake. We decided we'd go over their filings with a fine-tooth comb. And we found many irregularities. So we then summarized our irregularities. And because we found they couldn't account for something like $2.7 million of their expenses. They were just not on the spreadsheet, but they were on the total. Where was that money going? Was it going under the table? More than likely, yes. But what they did, to me, was really astounding. They said, okay, we'll take care of that problem. They amended their filings for 2023. They went from being number 3 lobbyist in California to essentially nothing. Now, our consultant in Sacramento said that is really, really unusual, because it's like unringing a bell. You can't do it. But they did it because they have a huge, they have hired people, and they also work through other third parties. So because we're undercapitalized, and we'll talk about that too, because the state played a big role in making sure that we were undercapitalized, that we didn't, basically we didn't have the means to contest that they had lied. They had committed criminal perjury. There should be people in prison today for what Pacific Corp did. But no.
So that's really fascinating about what you're describing there. And I just want to go back a little bit to the point about the precautionary principle,
Yeah.
because it's really at the heart of what net zero is, where it's like, oh, maybe if we have these emissions, it could be harmful to the temperature in 2100 or 2200 or something so far away that people can't really prove one thing or another or
Right.
whatever. And it's interesting that the way you're describing not just how the idea of the precautionary principle gets exploited and thrown out there to slow things down, to shut things down and whatnot. It's also the diversity of interest that you're talking about, because there's the ones who want to keep the power going because they're making lots of money from other jurisdictions, and they're happy to have California be weak because they can supply it and make lots of money. Then you have maybe the real environmentalists who do have some legitimate fears, whatever, about nuclear power, but then that all gets exploited, and maybe back to some extent by China. But China looks and sees all of these different competing interests to try and shut things down or to shape the whatever California's energy policy is, which is supposedly clean and whatnot. And it's really a microcosm of what's happening in other net zero aligned jurisdictions. I think that sort of background exploitation of varied local interests by China is happening across the world and not just California. But California is providing a really good microcosm of what happens when there's these other interests who are trying to shape the energy and climate policy and the impact that has on energy security and the economic situation of California, what it's like for citizens.
So it turns out that China is not you kind of described China in that as a disinterested party. They are very actively interested. Why? Well, California is distinguished in many ways. It's the most populous state in the union. It's essentially the westernmost of the continental U.S. And it has, according to Governor Newsom's website, 44 military bases and federally funded research and development centers. The most significant one, in my opinion, is Vandenberg Space Force Base.
Yeah.
And I'm a space nerd. I've been a space nerd for a long time. I was actually, I applied 3 times to be a space shuttle mission specialist astronaut candidate trainee. Try to say that real fast. You only can if you practice. That that one resource, among other things, they have a squadron of mid-course intercept missiles. So let's say North Korea decides to send an atomic bomb to the U.S. Well, that one Space Force base really plays an important role. I've been to the base a few times. It really is an amazing place. But they clearly, it depends on reliable power. It's actually powered by Pacific Gas and Electric. Yes. It's near the end of the lines for Pacific Gas and Electric, but it's still powered by Pacific Gas and Electric. And they probably have some diesel generators that might power critical systems for a few days. But if the grid were taken down, it's a very real possibility that Vandenberg would become blinded very quickly. That, to me, is very scary. And there are people, I think, within the Department of War that are now recognizing that critical vulnerability and are looking at, well, what can we do? And some have even raised the idea of putting in small modular reactors to power Vandenberg Space Force Base. But that's the real big issue that I see is that China recognizes you got all these bases, and if we can do what Michael Pillsbury talks about, and he was very much a pioneer in talking about something called assassin's mace weapons. And an assassin's mace weapon exploits the strategic vulnerabilities of your adversary, and you might be able to prevail by using this without even firing a shot.
Yeah.
And that is what reliable power means for California. Is, are we going to be able to resist an attack by China or one of its proxies? And they have plenty of proxies. We have them throughout the Middle East, and they clearly have them in places like North Korea. I'm one of my other little, I guess you could call it hobbies, is I have learned a lot about nuclear proliferation. I touched briefly at the beginning on the fact that I have some firsthand experience at Los Alamos National Labs. Los Alamos is where the U.S. atomic bomb was invented. And as I was finishing my PhD, because I had utilized some work that was done at Los Alamos in doing my PhD, I reached out to them for the possibility of doing a postdoc there. And so they invited me out there for a week. And I gave a talk. People were very interested in what I had to say. And I got a mentor who started to work with me on preparing a postdoc proposal, because basically I have to raise my own money to come out to Los Alamos. And so that meant, coming up with a project. And so I was working on a project involving remote sensing, using things like a U2 to send down beams of ultraviolet light to interrogate crop health from the heights of a U2. Well, that was a really intellectually interesting project. And I'm starting to work on it. I was able to show a proof of concept, which I thought I came up with a very elegant way to show that it would change the UV emission spectra when a plant was stressed. And so and again, this is 1981. George Keyworth, who at that time was head of the labs, became President Reagan's science advisor. And, it seems that, things are really going well. I get a call one day that said, the program's been defunded.
Oh
So
my
I'm
gosh.
sorry, we're gonna withdraw any possible postdoc for you. Sorry, goodbye. Well, for me, it didn't end with that goodbye. I started to pay attention to what was going on at Los Alamos because, as the Cox Commission revealed prior to my congressional testimony, China had went from having the first generation, really very inefficient, very large atomic bomb that they'd gotten from the Soviets to the state of the art from the U.S., something called the W-88 warhead. Now, the W-88 warhead, I actually wrote up an article about this. There's a picture of me standing next to a reentry body for a W-88 because this was designed for use with the so-called MX or Peacekeeper missile, which could have up to 12 of these in the nose cone of this ICBM. And the weapon itself, you can get an idea of its dimensions by looking at the reentry body, because they have a reentry body at a thing called the Space Heritage Museum at Vandenberg. And when I saw that, it was, whoa, this is really, really significant. I made sure that my wife took a picture of me standing next to that. Because what you can do pretty simply is to figure out, okay, what's the realistic dimensions of this thing? And from that, estimate its mass, which is classified, but we can place an upper bound at about 400 kilograms. For this is a fission weapon that's something, well, it can produce up to almost a half a megaton.
Wow.
And it has a mass of about 400 kilograms. And the Cox Commission said this was something that the Chinese set off in the early 1990s. So not that long after I'd interviewed there. And of course, what did I discover? Well, at the time, Los Alamos was administered by the University of California system. The University of California is part of the Association of American Universities, and they, in fact, were lobbying for this program to minimize their costs. And so they were bringing over plane loads of people that have been trained in the U.S., so they were didn't really involve that transport, but they were trained in the U.S., and then they were working at Los Alamos, and they were tasked with getting the design for the W-88. Now, the U.S. had compartmentalized things, but because there was such a massive influx of Chinese, very bright people, they were able to put all the pieces together.
Well, for sure. And that's part of their strategy, right? Is to steal or acquire technology for strategic advantage.
It's a lot cheaper to steal than it is to invent.
Of course.
China is a master of stealing technology. And that was, again, something that Pillsbury has really been very critical of. He had said, if the U.S. would at least even just threaten China at the time with actually looking at what was going over there, because there were something like 50 different agreements to transfer technology to the Chinese, often for no cost at all. And of course, China made a mockery of intellectual property protections. And they came up with ways. Again, China is run by a bunch of really smart people that have at their goal, what Pillsbury makes a very strong case, that their goal is world domination. They want to become the world's superpower within a century of the establishment of the People's Republic of China, which was in 1949.
Yeah.
They're well on their way.
For sure. It's a great book that I'll put a link to in the description. It's called The 100-Year Marathon by Michael Pillsbury.
Michael Pillsbury. Unfortunately, what I did was I took an electronic copy of that book and I searched for solar, wind, and renewable. Nothing. Because it was a bit, I think that the whole idea of what China was doing with the environmental movement wasn't really apparent to Michael at the time that he wrote that book, which is 2015.
Yeah, it was just kind of starting
It was
the whole
just
net
starting.
zero movement. Yeah,
Right. But it actually, the movement itself started around the time that China was admitted to the World Trade
trade
Organization.
organization. Yeah,
And when I was a graduate student, I had one of the things, my office was right near a great big lecture hall, and so there's all this, there would be people waiting to come to their classes, and what I did was I put up news stories about science on my door, and I had it just completely covered by the time I had finished my PhD, and I remember stories about the coming ice age. This was a story that was
yeah,
being told to places like Time and Newsweek while I was earning my doctorate. Well, suddenly this narrative changes around the year 2000 to carbon dioxide is this horrible thing. Oh, and we've got to get rid of nuclear power in the United States. Well, wait a minute. What's China doing with those things? Well, I don't know if this is the time to bring up the issue, the thing from Our World in Data, but I
sure.
think it's a really powerful thing that you can do yourself. So you can first of all go out to Our World in Data, which is its URL is ourworldindata.org, all mashed together, and then there's a search bar on the home page, and so just put in annual CO2 emissions for China. That's all you got to do. Just put that in, and you're going to get a plot. There's actually multiple plots in there, but you don't really see it when you first look at it, because the plot that you see that's most significant is about what happened with China, which is this upward pointing curve here. They have become the world's greatest emitter or supplier of carbon dioxide. The world's greatest.
That's right.
They, in fact, their level of carbon dioxide production is about triple that of the number 2 nation, which is the United States. Now, how do you get that United States thing? It's kind of, it shows me the kind of groupthink that goes on. You would think that one of the most obvious things to have on that plot would be to automatically show the United States in comparison.
Yeah.
Nope. No, they show things like the Maldives. The Maldives. So you have to
Yeah.
unselect all those useless things, which are essentially on the scale of that plot. They're just along the bottom axis. So you can't even see them. So you unselect all those, put in the United States, and it's really significant to note that since about the year 2000, the U.S. has been slowly and steadily reducing its carbon dioxide production. And they've been doing it through a really simple mechanism. They've substituted natural gas for coal. That's it, right there.
Yeah.
So that's been a big mechanism for decarbonization in the U.S. And in fact, China overtook the U.S. in carbon dioxide production around 2006. And again, they're now at 3 times the level of the U.S. So if we have a nation that actually accounts for about 1/3 of global carbon dioxide emissions, why aren't they being held to the same standard as the industrial West? Because this is a global problem. But this narrative says China is a developing nation. They need to use coal to develop their economy. Excuse me, they're not a developing nation. They have a space program that's on par with the US. That's not a developing nation.
Exactly.
They have an economy that is poised to overtake the US in terms of GDP. But when you look at what Pillsbury talks about in his book, it's one of the things that China has learned to soft pedal, is the fact that there is this big, that's their goal, is world domination, to become the world superpower.
Yeah,
And
and they're very patient about it. They're very patient
absolutely,
with, their
absolutely,
10-year plans and
yeah.
whatever. And I think what's fascinating is that China, let me just phrase it this way. China's expanding every form of power. They're using coal, they're using nuclear, natural gas, wind and solar, and all of that, kind of all of the above moves, is to lock in its industrial and military advantage.
Hmm.
Meanwhile, you've got, if we were to juxtapose what California's it's doing its clean power plan. It's hesitating on whether or not it should extend the operation of its last nuclear power plant beyond 2030. Governor Newsom, as you put out on your Substack the other day, has said, well, I'm just going to leave it to the next governor to make a decision on that, even though federal regulators have cleared it to run into the mid 2040s, which is a little bit concerning, but maybe not. The fact that I think right now Diablo Canyon's 40 years old, and I don't think there's anything in the pipeline in California to build anything new. But
There's a
meanwhile,
moratorium. There's a moratorium.
there's a moratorium, right? Meanwhile, China understands that reliable, affordable energy is the absolute key for economic and military dominance. And so they're pressing ahead, doing all this stuff. They know you can't run a manufacturing plant, you can't run data centers without reliable energy. And and so they are committing full on, while at the same time they convince the environmental organizations to give them glowing reports. Oh, look, China's building up their solar. They built all these wind turbines. They have all these EVs. Oh my gosh, they have so many. They need to export them, and they do it so cheap. Why doesn't everyone just buy a Chinese EV? This is the argument we're hearing in Canada, in the UK, in Europe. It's like, oh, but I would just really love to buy one of those Chinese EVs. They're so affordable and they're really good, and so on and so forth. So China's been really good at doing a PR campaign and having all these activist groups that go after Americans and Europeans and Canadians
Mhm.
as if they're the devil, and give China a pass, that they're so uncritical about what China's doing.
Mhm.
And, one has to ask yourself, why is that? Why do the environmental groups always give China a pass? And I've heard people talk about different theories or reasons for that. I think funding's part of it. I think another part is um, they won't be permitted in China if they criticize China, and they want to
Absolutely.
maintain a presence there.
Well,
So,
go back to Pillsbury, and I had to go through a very tedious process, but in the end, I struck pay dirt. Um, he was at the time, in the early 20s, he was with um, uh, the Hudson Institute, and
yeah,
so their search engine is really awful. And so I eventually was finally able to convince it to show me just he has over 300 entries. So I said, just show me from 2000 to the present. And so I found an article from September of 2022 where he criticizes the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC. And NRDC at that time operates, operated, and probably still operates a branch in China.
yeah,
And they are part of that greenwashing of China.
yeah.
Well, but it's also a great conduit for taking Chinese funds and feeding them into the US for this environmental movement. And of course, China, I'm sure, paid very close attention to what happened in Germany with
Hmm.
having where Vladimir Putin basically utilized the tools of statecraft and bribery to convince Germany to shut down its perfectly well maintained and safe nuclear power fleet so that they could weaponize their abundant natural gas. And that's what they did. They weaponized it. And so Germany really did not lift much of a finger when Russia um, invaded for a second time Ukraine. And that was a goal. was to basically silence a potential adversary. And in fact, it's so successful that a lot of the big firms that are dependent on a reliable supply of energy are leaving Germany
Yeah.
because of this policy. And the policy makes zero sense because if you, again, you look at things globally, here's a nation that, again, more than a third of carbon dioxide production. And of course, the environmental standards in China are much more lax than in the US. They may show you, oh, yeah, we have this new supercritical coal plant, but they don't show you the fact that they're opening, 2 a week of these lower quality that don't have all the environmental standards. Just look at this one window dressing plant, because China, they were actually quite proud of the fact, and they published this in I think it was about a year ago. The embassy of the People's Republic of China in the United States pointed out on Facebook, China produces more power than the next 6 nations combined. More
Yeah.
power. And they are the world superpower on electric power. And again, they use all of the above. They have this window dressing of solar and wind because they are exporting those and batteries. But actually, I believe, and there's some evidence now showing up, that a lot of their wind production in particular, their wind generators, are not connected to the grid. So it's kind of like what they did with the apartments, where you might remember the
Yeah.
pictures of the vacant apartments,
Yeah.
because the central, the Politburo said, well, we're going to build apartments. And they basically created an incredible glut of apartments. And I think the same story is going now, that same idea of keeping the factories running and making it
Yeah.
look like they are doing the right thing environmentally, but in reality, it's coal, baby, coal.
Well, since that comment, I think it was Donald Trump had made it a couple times where he said, well, those wind turbines aren't even, they're just spinning and they're not even connected to the grid, and neither is their solar. I think it was a few weeks ago, China released a new plan, well, to increase the connections or to connect all these different places to the grid, which then indicates they weren't connected in the first place,
That's
right?
right.
So
Yes.
it's like, okay, we better cover our butts here and
Yes.
make this
Yes.
announcement or whatever.
Absolutely. But
But
it's
for our listeners, before we just continue, I want to give some numbers here. I know some people don't like numbers, but I think this is important. China has over 1,195 operational coal power plants. They have 60, according to the International Atomic Energy Association, they have 60 operational nuclear power plants. And they have 37 under construction. There's 32 in the planning stage with a target of 110 gigawatts of nuclear power installed by 2030. They also have approximately, and this is a little more difficult to determine if it's accurate, 243 operational natural gas power plants. So their grid is enormous, and I'm not even factoring in all the wind and solar they supposedly have in on their grid or whatever, what they built for capacity building or whatever. But the fact that they are building and approving so much nuclear and so much reliable coal, and I say reliable because that's something that they do have. They have a fair amount of coal, even
They
though
have
they're increasing
the
production.
number three reserves in
Number
the
three,
world.
reserves. Yeah, exactly. And so that's something they control. Natural gas, they're reliant on LNG. They do produce some natural gas. I hear that they've been deploying different fracking techniques and whatnot in order to increase their own domestic production. But they are quite reliant on Russia and other foreign actors for their natural gas as well as their oil. And with respect to nuclear, yes, that's great. But with China, if a nuclear power plant is taken out, that's complicated and dangerous. And but for them, coal is number one. It's reliable, it's easy for them, but they're not, but like I said before, they're building everything because they understand that having all of that reliable uh, energy is fundamental to energy security and industrial production, which allows them to project power in the world to meet that 2049 goal of the 100-year marathon.
Absolutely. So they're very serious about this. And of course, by utilizing impression management, they are lulling the world into basically, just so now this then brings up another piece of how China projects its power. And that is they're also really good at malware.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm anticipating that that CGNP, Californians for Green Nuclear Power, which is at cgnp.org, we will be attacked by China or by its proxies. It's going to happen. So just be aware that occasionally we may be offline because China does. That's how they deal with their critics. Now,
Yeah.
inside of China, it's done very quickly and efficiently with a bullet. Now, getting back to those postdocs for just a minute, one of the things that I learned from my second wife before we divorced, she finished her PhD while we were still legally married, was that there were Chinese graduate students at her university, which is a University of Akron in Ohio. And what she shared was that their approach to make sure that the students were they're tasked with gathering intelligence. They keep family members in China
Yeah.
as hostages.
Yeah.
And every once in a while, they really publicize, oh, this person didn't do their job for the People's Liberation Army and their family was killed. They tell that enough and they show it enough that they get remarkable loyalty. This is the kind of adversary that we really need to be aware of. It is a ruthless adversary that really, for a long time, China was the most populous nation. They're very indifferent about life. Very indifferent. They're not a Western democracy, and they never have been a Western democracy. That is really important. That's one of the points that Pillsbury still makes. He's now with a new think tank in Washington, D.C. He's no longer with the Hudson. But it's really, we ignore these facts at our own peril. That's the important thing here.
That's a really great point about China having it's a different culture. It's a
Yeah.
different political system. And I think part of the hubris that operates in our discourse is that we assume that the Chinese political system is just like ours, when it's a communist dictatorship. The communists control everything in society. And they have very clear ideas and strategic direction. And I think there's a lot of different policymakers and in North America and Europe who kind of envy that they envy the sort of central planning
Mhm.
that happens by committee and are trying to roll that out on a global scale with net zero.
Mhm.
And so, of course, China is thinking this is great from a couple of different perspectives. Number one, they get the rest of the world to start behaving like China, which makes it easier when China wants to exert its influence in the world because everyone will be kind of operating in a similar system.
And I
And
think,
then go
well,
ahead.
California is a test bed for that because
Exactly.
China
Yeah,
aggressively lobbies the California state government. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. They use, they do it directly and indirectly. The indirect approach is through organizations like the NRDC, and of course, the direct approach is, well, they just hire their own lobbyists, and
that's
that's
right.
how this whole concept of net zero is really have been put in place by lobbying, and lobbying sometimes by very unseemly manner, including for example, turning up embarrassing information about a leader. That's a classic Chinese technique.
Yeah.
So,
Well, anybody.
yeah,
They,
but
I think there's a lot. Yeah.
it's really, this is about a totalitarian state that controls its citizens. It's not a democracy. It's never been a democracy, and we really need to be aware of what the reality is, not what we want it to be,
Yeah.
or to say, well, this is going to happen after I'm dead, so I really don't care. Well, most people have, kids, and those kids are going to inherit this world that really is a much less friendly place. And I see China working very hard to destabilize things in the Middle East right now, for the sole purpose they want that energy from the
Yeah.
Middle East. And you look at the tankers that are getting through right now. Well, where are they going? China and India. That's no accident.
Yeah. Well,
And
because they're dependent on it. They're
yes,
dependent
oh,
on
absolutely, they
that
are.
area, just like, and China was getting discounted oil
Absolutely.
from Russia, from Venezuela.
Mhm.
As long as they were helpful to Russia, then they were getting deals on different things.
Yeah.
Especially, Europe, you have to wonder. So they have all these sanctions against Russia, saying we're not going to buy your natural gas. Um, the pipeline is blown up or whatever. And who benefits from that? Well, China actually benefits from that,
Mhm.
because if Russia can't sell their LNG to anybody else, then China gets a deal, just like they were getting it on oil, right?
Right, and there, in fact, there's a new pipeline being built right now today,
Yeah,
between Russia and China.
yeah.
Gee, what a shock! And
What a shock.
and the, getting back to coal for just a moment, when I looked into those coal reserves, the article also talked about the fact that, well, China is using up its reserves really, really fast,
Yeah.
and they're projecting 30 to 40 years they'll be out of coal, out of their domestically produced coal, because they're burning it so aggressively. Well, who's number two? Russia.
Yeah.
Why not just annex Russia and becomes part of China? That's, I think, a very realistic long-term possibility. And that is not a good that's not a good situation, because basically, they talk about the Western world being we're hegemons. No, they are simply projecting their desire for world domination. And
Yeah, and it's interesting because energy policy and energy security is a central component for that dominance, because reliable, affordable, dense energy, it underpins the industrial capacity, the military modernization,
Mhm.
food security through fertilizer production,
Right.
shipbuilding, steel production,
Yeah.
and just
All
just overall sovereign power, right?
Yeah, yeah, energy, energy, energy. And Robert Bryce has really worked
Yeah,
hard to get that. And I think you've had him on already, right?
yeah,
Okay, so he's tried to get that message through, but it's really a super important message. I'll put in a little plug for his movie, Juice: How Electricity Explains Everything. It's available now for free. You can watch it on YouTube. Just Google it. It's a dynamite movie, and again, it emphasizes that theme with clearly he was trying to save Indian Point, which is a totally unnecessary closure that took place, but again,
yeah,
pushed by the left,
yeah,
and remarkable, and of course having some capitalists who would benefit. So we had the
yeah.
competitive power ventures. Well, they bribed via Joseph Percoco, the Cuomo administration, to shut down Indian Point. Gee, nice
Yeah, so
democracy.
I mean, it's interesting how China, as I said earlier, exploits those sort of local and domestic
Hmm.
interests, right? And
Yes.
and it makes sense. If you were going in to try and undermine your adversary, wouldn't you use the sort of local disgruntled people or the greedy people or the
Mhm.
selfish people? Absolutely. It makes
Absolutely,
complete
and
sense, right?
absolutely. So I'm just kind of curious, what steps, you don't have to tell me other than maybe a yay or a nay. Are you very careful about potential malicious attacks on your website?
Yeah. Yeah,
Good.
I am.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that
So,
because,
yeah, because you never know. Stu talks about it all the time.
right.
How his site is often under bombardment
Hmm.
by different interests and whatnot, and that's modern that's modern day stuff, right? This
Right,
is what
right. So
happens
we have to
nowadays.
be able to take counter moves, and fortunately, there are counter moves. But
Yeah,
it's definitely, information, control of information is really super super important. Um, we recently had a power failure here, and of course, when I tried to get a hold of the internet to even find out from the power company, okay, when's the power coming back on? Nope, no information, because the internet provider was dependent on Pacific Gas and Electric, and they hadn't backed up everything. So we were essentially completely in the dark. Uh,
wow.
and that is really, I'm also an amateur radio operator, so I'm really big on preparation.
Yeah,
So I have generators, I have solar panels, I have batteries, all that stuff to keep my emergency radio equipment running. Uh, but really, the issue of information is super important, and it is built. The flow of information is built on having a reliable power system. And
absolutely.
so that's why this really, basically, if your adversary is blinded because you've been able to take out their power system, you have just such huge advantages. And that's really what's in store. This is we. This is going to be a really challenging time ahead of us to fight this, because it's been going on for such a long time. And there's a concept called the Overton window.
Yeah,
What is allowable to talk about? And I know that, at the time that Pillsbury came out with his book, The 100-Year Marathon, he was really working to expand the Overton window so that people would really start to understand what we're up against. And, still, the other side is really has made tremendous progress since 2015 to, essentially get rid of reliable power in the West, in the Austral
yeah,
West. UK, definitely, it's a big, big problem there with them shutting off supplies of natural gas that they had been using, because, oh, yeah, it's going to make a big difference. And of course, again, you go out to our world and data and put in the UK, you
it's like
discover
1%.
they're less than 1/10 of what the US is. And again, the US is on a downward trajectory, just like the UK. And what are you doing? You're essentially creating energy poverty, and also you're creating a strategic vulnerability. Those are
Yeah,
really, really big, big things. So I applaud you for working to get the word out, and getting me, allowing me some time to talk about it. We really haven't talked too much about the nuts and bolts. CGNP, as an intervener, we have filed thousands of pages. I'm mentored by Attorney Gatto. Uh, we were nearly bankrupted by the state because there's a system called intervener compensation, where interveners are they have to put in for the expenses that they've paid, and they can then get reimbursement from essentially the ratepayers. It's
yeah,
the biggest system in the United States. It's the most developed, but it is under very tight political control. CGNP, because we were new, we were able to get something like $250,000 in the first part of the Diablo Canyon proceeding, even though the commission eventually decided to shut the plant down. Uh, and we were, again, we're the lone party of 55. Even PG&E was in agreement. We found out later that they were essentially extorted by the state to do that through a separate agency called the State Lands Commission. The State Lands Commission, they had a lease that didn't align with the operating license, so they had to start using the intake and outfall about 7 years before the plant went into power production. So the state basically said, "Oh, you want that lease to be extended? Well, you agree to our deal. And our deal is you withdraw your almost complete application for relicensing." So that was a really ugly situation to find out. And again, CGMP worked to try to make people aware of what the state was doing. The State Lands Commission, its charter by the California Constitution, is to assure a fair rate of return for private use of assets held in the public trust. That's its job.
Yeah.
PG&E had been paying its bills, but still, they asserted that they had a safety function, and the safety function was based on what the antis had to say about this plant. This plant, again, is one of the safest plants in California. They try to bring up about earthquakes, and the plant was tested by a major earthquake. It was a 6.3, not that far away. It was in northern San Luis Obispo County. The plant's in central San Luis Obispo County, so it was roughly 20 miles away. And the plant, this was the so-called San Simeon earthquake, was strong enough to kill 2 in Paso Robles. But the plant was running at full power before, during, and after. It was because it's built so ruggedly. And there's a book out there called Atomic Dreams by Rebecca Tostebro. She describes me in that book. I have a chapter, it's called The Guy in the Headband. I recommend the book very highly. It's easily located. But I'm a sturdy man. I weigh a bit over 250 right now. I stand 6'3", and I'm dwarfed by the support beams in the power deck of Diablo Canyon. Because when I was a professor at Cuesta College, I essentially brought through a group of students to see the power deck at Diablo Canyon. And so we got down to the basement, and where these giant beams are anchored by reinforced concrete columns that go down 100 feet into the rock, solid rock. And I'm dwarfed by those beams. Not surprising, because the plant, again, is designed to withstand a really substantial earthquake. Their earthquake would basically be strong enough to literally throw things around. They would take flight because the earthquake was shaking so strongly, but the plant would still, all its safety systems would still run, even in that strong earthquake. But the likelihood of that earthquake is really, really small, because the big activity in San Luis Obispo County is on the opposite side of San Luis Obispo County, where the San Andreas Fault, which is the border between the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate, that fault is where the action is going to be. But the thing is that the Pacific Plate side is all young, heavily fractured rock, because not that long ago it was underneath the Gulf of it was the Gulf of California. It was underneath the water, and so basically, when you have that kind of rock, it's not like granite back east in Canada or in the U.S. It attenuates the earthquake energy really, really fast. So again, the plant was designed for any plausible earthquake. But again, they can apply the antis will apply the precautionary principle. Say, oh, it could happen.
Good, yeah.
And then treat it as
China
if
go ahead. Sorry.
They would treat it as if it their way of dealing with it is, this is what's going to really happen, as opposed to what could happen. And I recall the mindset of one of the antis who happened to go to the same church that I went to. That church is, in fact, where the Slow Mothers for Peace was founded about 50 years ago. Um, and it's a very left-leaning church. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. But I'm a conservative, and I still go there because I like the idea of not having, they have a liberal version of theology, which I am aligned with. But
Okay.
the the so I'm talking with this woman who I've seen in church with another member of CGNP at a DCISC meeting, the Diablo Independent Safety Committee. And she says, don't bother. Well, because we're trying to explain things to her. Don't bother. My mind is already made up. That's the kind of, as a scientist, that's basically a recipe for failure. When if I basically say, oh, a particular paradigm is it can't be challenged. Well, I'm certainly aware that progress is made by challenging those paradigms. And this new paradigm that somehow or another CO2 is a really dangerous thing, it's not based on physical reality. It's based on politics. And that is really, really significant to me because, well, actually, I was just recently invited to join the CO2 Coalition because I'm actually using my brain to analyze the data. And again, it wasn't that long ago that we were concerned about a coming ice age. There's a lot of natural variability. I worked for NASA JPL at one time, that's Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena, and I certainly became aware at that, while I worked there, that solar energy was really determined, because this was pre this woke stuff that we have now, that the amount of solar energy we get is really dependent on the sun, and the sun's output is variable. There's lots of cycles to how the sun. So anyway, it's really frustrating to see how basically science has been twisted by by politics, and the politics, unfortunately, are carefully designed from the get-go to favor the People's Republic of China. And that is something we have to be aware of, and we have to go in with our eyes open, not wishfully thinking that, China can be reformed. No, it cannot be reformed. We're dealing with actually some of the cultural norms that China uses were in place 500 years ago. And they're still in place.
And they're still in place. Just as we kind of wrap it up here, I want to ask this question, because you mentioned you had a power outage and you talk about how the politics is so much driving all of these different things that destabilizes the grid. And I think California provides some good evidence that when you have this rapid solar wind battery, and I don't even know how rapid that is, the prices stay elevated. There's land use conflicts. The grid is unreliable, and they're like, okay, don't charge your EV because you could destabilize the grid and whatnot. And this, what you talked about with the power outages, it's like this unreliability is politically driven, because if you let the grid operators just build what's required to ensure that there's reliability, that it's affordable for people, they would be able to do it. But it's like they're hamstrung by all of these different political considerations, especially in alignment with net zero. The policymakers and committees come up with these different criteria for power generation that grid operators are like, well, that's just going to make things more expensive. But the political people are like, no, it's going to be cheaper. We hear this all the time in the UK. Every month the bill goes up, and they tell the politicians come out and say, no, your bill's gone down. It's like, but I can show you it hasn't. They're like, well, don't believe your lying eyes, because we're telling you it's gone down. It's like, but it's not true. So there's these different political things that are going on, and I'm wondering, how this trend of unreliability, how does that connect to the risks that they pose for American national security? You did mention the Vandenberg base and all
Mhm.
of the other bases that are in California, but what about the risk of the California example becoming the example for other states in America? And how does that, what risk does that pose for American national security?
It poses a huge risk. California is already distinguished. Their retail rates are roughly twice the national average. They are
Wow.
typically the most expensive of the continental United States. And it is because of their emphasis on solar, wind, and batteries. So California has the greatest amount of solar and the greatest amount of batteries, I think, both. The wind hasn't been as strong in California. There, but the bottom line is that California, if you look at the number of outages that have had significant adverse economic impact, California is now the leader.
Hmm.
They're the leader.
Wow.
And that is really significant. And if we want to look at it from just look at a small example of this, look at what happened in Spain on April the 28th, 2025, where the socialist government there, the PSOE, said, we want to show the world that we can run a modern economy on solar and wind. They didn't have much batteries. And what happened was midday when the solar production was the maximum, and they had two perfectly good nuclear power reactors that were offline because they had a unique Spanish tax where they partially subsidized the cost of their expensive solar and wind by taxing their reliable, safe nuclear power because they plan on shutting it down by 2035.
Yeah.
What happened? Well, they had a massive power failure, and in that massive power failure, at least 11 people who were depending on reliable power that day lost their lives.
Yeah.
11 people. And the economic harm was the lost productivity and the damaged production equipment. And that, of course, they're not being transparent about that. But you can do some simple math to figure out they've essentially lost a whole day of productivity. And you can figure out what their GDP is and divide it by 365. And there you've got a cost. And of course, their reputation took a big
Yeah.
hit. If you're thinking of building a business, well, and Spain can't keep the lights on, well, that's really going to be a decision against going to Spain. So this is those are warning signs. But the socialists have worked to try to get you to ignore those warning
Yeah.
signs. And
That's
that
right.
is, we ignore those physical realities at our own peril.
Well, you mentioned, people will have to make a decision on whether or not they want to open up a business in Spain, and it reminds me of Robert Bryce's documentary Juiced, where in Lebanon, how
Yeah.
people would have these little generators running around all the time because they couldn't rely on the grid. And it's like, do we really want to become like Lebanon, where it's so unreliable that, here they're in the UK, they're talking about load control, which is a euphemism for rationing. So,
Yes.
like, yesterday there was a solar eclipse,
Hmm.
and they were sending out messages. The major um, power operator in the UK, we're sending around messages, lots of news stories. Don't use power between 6 and 8 p.m. because the grid will be compromised due to the eclipse. I'm like, what? That's crazy that we're
That,
in a supposedly a first world country, and
right.
they're telling you, sorry, you can't use your washing machine or cook supper because there's a solar eclipse.
And this is part of mind control. It's getting people to be pliant to that top-down control that you talked about earlier in
Yeah.
our talk. And, so you make it kind of a game. That's actually what they did in California, is they made it a game. Can we get enough people to turn off their power that we don't get a big rolling blackout? Because we got really dangerously close to one just before SB 846 was passed. So it was very fortuitous that we had that reality. People were staring, they knew, the decision makers in Sacramento were aware, hey, we really have a fragile grid. And it doesn't, and the thing is, that junk power wasn't there. There wasn't wind. There was a wind drought because it was a big high pressure area. And it was, the big problem was after 5 p.m. So the sun was already setting. I mean, you've paid tens of billions of dollars for inherently unreliable power. And California talks about its batteries. Well, they have the greatest amount of batteries, but they're 4-hour batteries. And how many times is a problem going to be neatly confined to 4 hours? In fact, we showed data in our filings to the PUC that they actually had batteries that ran out before the outage, or before the really big challenge was, where there was the peak load day. And as a result, they had to increase their imports. And the problem was, because it was a region-wide thing, they had to pay a lot extra for that imported power on that day. So it's just, and
because it's like the solution, instead of building your own power, is to rely on interconnections from other jurisdictions, which have their own demands and whatnot. And in Europe, for example, Norway has become like this huge power supplier for the rest of the country, but for the union, but it's driving up local power prices. And the Norwegian citizens were like, wait a second, why do we have to pay more because the rest of Europe isn't building enough of their own power? And when it was reliable power, and when the Spanish blackout happened, it took out Portugal, and it almost took out France. But France, because they were supplying, there was this interconnection going back and forth. They had breakers that went off to cut it off before it created a cascade effect through France. And France has been smart building up their nuclear, and now they're sort of refurbishing a lot. Macron originally, when he came to power, was going to shut them all down. 2015, all that, we're going to close nuclear stuff. And then he realized, oh, wait a second, that would be a bad idea. But if I can just kind of finish up here, one of the funny things is we're experiencing a heat wave in the UK, and there's certain cities and communities that ban air conditioning because it violates net zero. And so one of the funny things was that a bunch of Chinese influencers were trolling the UK and France and whatnot, and had air conditioners in their pig barns. And they were just laughing at, we can have as much air conditioning as we want, and you silly Westerners can't. And I thought that was really fascinating that they were taking it up to that sort of trolling thing, because we're supposed to be a civilized country. You should be able to choose whether or not you want air conditioning to stay cool when it's hot. And instead they were shaming people and saying, you should just put up with it. But
and that certainly reminds me of the George Orwell book Animal Farm. And it's a literal example that some pigs are more equal than others. Because the pigs in the Chinese pig barns, where they have abundant power, are the ones that are getting the air conditioning, while the Europeans and UK are not. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, well, it was really funny because at the European Commission, where Ursula von der Leyen, who's the president, has her offices, they shut the air conditioning off for the lower levels, but kept it on for the upper levels. And the upper levels were where she and the other commissioners were. So
exactly.
Right there, right? Yeah, it just makes me laugh.
Anyway, I know we're running out of time. We're running out of time. We probably want dinner. So
yes, and I have one question for you to close it.
Sure.
on a positive note.
Okay.
Many people feel powerless, when they face these activists and issues.
Mhm.
So, what can the average citizen do to set things right?
Well, the big thing is to work on becoming informed about this. And also, one of my favorite little sayings is from Margaret Mead, who talked about the fact that one person can make a difference. So rather than, when I saw something that really ticked me off, I decided to use my knowledge, skills, and ability to push for let's go with the reality, not with the emotionally favored narrative regarding nuclear power. So I think that's the big thing, is that we can take the power back, but we have to choose, very actively choose to do it. And it does take hard work. I've invested well over 30,000 hours on this project. I've spent a lot of money on the project, but I think it's the most important project because my summary is, if we get this wrong, we're done as a species. And we should be focused on energy abundance, energy security, not on this crazy propaganda called net zero, because it's just that. It's propaganda.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jean, for this great conversation and for sharing your insights and knowledge on this issue. And I'll put links in the description to your writings and some of the things that we've been talking about. And I hope you have a great day. Thank you so much.
You bet.